Welcome once again to Latveria Library, where I go over some of my favorite comic book stories. A couple of years ago, a buddy of mine had gifted me a certain comic. Since I really enjoyed Scott Snyder's Witches and Batman run, I still need to read American Vampire though. He figured I would love his latest that had just come out at the time. Well, I finally just got around to reading it, and it was so good that I just really had to talk about it. AD After Death is a deeply personal and emotional story about life and death that feels more like a sci-fi indie drama movie script put out by A24 than an actual comic. But that definitely wasn't a bad thing. I was totally glued to the book and found myself thinking about it for days after I had finished it. I kept putting myself into our main character's shoes and wondering if I would have made the same choices. To me, that's what separates an absolutely incredible story like this, The Watchmen, Kingdom Come, Punk Rock Jesus, just to name a few, and the stories that are just good. Oh, before I forget, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you enjoy the video. It really helps out the channel. I'm hoping to hit 1,000 subs by the end of the year. When I do, I'm going to start working on a massive project. But for now, let's get into Scott Snyder and Jeff Lemire's masterpiece, AD After Death. The entire story is seen through the eyes of Jonah Cook, a salesman by day and professional thief by night. He sees himself as nothing special, somebody who would never do anything that would matter, and yet is one of the key reasons that there was a cure for death, and why the world is the way it is. Which I don't agree with that second part, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's rewind a bit to Jonah's earliest memory. It was 1982. His mother and father had planned a trip to Florida to get away from everything. The past year had been pretty rough. Jonah's father's job had been going through some massive budget cuts. He was a physics teacher at a high school, but also taught an elective class about 20th century political protest, which was his real passion. He just wished he could get his students to care as much as he did. It was pretty discouraging. But anyway, due to the budget cuts, Jonah's father was in danger of losing his job. On top of that, Jonah's parents had been trying to have more children, but had suffered a series of miscarriages, so they figured a little getaway would get their minds off of everything. Unfortunately, it hadn't worked out the way they had hoped. The weather was unseasonably frigid, which forced the family to spend most of their vacation in their hotel room. Jonah's father just couldn't take it anymore. The disappointment of Florida and everything back home was overwhelming, so they packed up their stuff a day early and headed home. But right before getting on the highway, they spotted something in the sky. As the object descended closer, Jonah was able to make out what it was. A balloon with some sort of blinking light inside of it. A ribbon was dangling from the bottom with a card attached to it. It was white with big red letters none of them could make out. So they began to follow it. They just had to know what it said. And suddenly, the balloon chase became the getaway they all desperately wanted all week. The family forgot about how terrible the past year was. Like it never existed. The only thing that mattered was this moment, the balloon, and the loving family's time together. After a long chase, even taking them on the interstate, the balloon finally began to descend. Quite fast, actually. It vanished behind a daycare center, and Jonah's father swerves across 4 empty lanes from fear of losing it. They found the balloon in an empty lot across from the center, and finally picked it up. The card read, "If you find this balloon, call the number below and you will win a prize." The family were ecstatic. It just felt right, like this was their reward for the horrible year and vacation. Jonah's father then walks over to a payphone and dials the number on the bottom of the card. Back in 1982, believe it or not, but there were payphones everywhere. After a few rings, somebody picks up. The voice on the other end explains that the contest was put on by an elementary school in New York. The goal was to see whose balloon could fly the farthest. Jonah's father laughs and says he's calling from Florida, so clearly this balloon won. But unfortunately, the contest ended weeks ago. The furthest had ended up in Trenton, New Jersey, but Jonah's father wasn't taking no for an answer. Jonah could see his father's back muscles begin to tense as he kept repeating to the person on the other end that we're in Florida, getting madder and madder each time he repeats the phrase, until he was yelling at the top of his lungs, becoming almost unintelligible. Just then, Jonah's mother begins to shake. She then falls to the ground like a switch just went off. She went completely limp, head hitting the ground first. Jonah screamed at his father, but he couldn't hear it over his own. His mother then began to shake even more, head thudding against the concrete while both Jonah and his father still screaming. Now, why is this part of the story so important? Well, this is the moment that changed everything. The moment that put Jonah on the path that ultimately leads him to the cure for death. His mom actually lives through her fall and falls 2 more times in the coming months. The family finds out it was nothing too serious, an easily fixable blood deficiency, basically cured by vitamin D. After this, life between the 3 of them became better than it ever had been. They all spent way more time together, laughing and enjoying life. All the worries and bad luck the family experienced seemed just so trivial after Jonah's mother's fall. It took that somewhat brush with death to make them all realize life was precious, but short, so enjoy the time you have with the ones you love. A simple but powerful message that resonates with everyone who's lost someone they care for. More so than most for our protagonist Jonah. It was true that he was happy, spending more time with his parents was great, but his anxiety and fears became worse and worse. The feeling that this happiness wouldn't last, it constantly gnawed at him, and eventually got to a point where he began writing down every single conversation with his parents. By the age of 12, life was as good as it ever was. Jonah's parents finally, after all these years of trying, were finally pregnant with another son, which Jonah was excited for, but that fear of death never went away. If anything, it was getting worse. As he describes it, it was like a need to record life as it was right then, before everything changed. This need is what led Jonah down the path to becoming a professional thief. Well, kind of. This was when I think he figured out how easy it was for him. But once again, I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll get to that later. For now, Jonah kept a journal where he would write down everything that happened that day. But now, as that need, as he called it, grew greater, the less he wanted to miss, which led him to the first thing he had ever stole, a tape recorder with 12 cassettes. He would then tape it underneath the dinner table so he could record conversations with his parents. And the moment he would press record, a wave of relief would wash over him, because he would now be able to relive this moment and many more conversations with his parents whenever he wanted, even if he felt stupid for worrying so much. But that relief didn't last long. A week later, Jonah's mother falls again, and it was much more serious this time. Within days, she was diagnosed with a connective tissue disorder that inhibits the body from making enough collagen, which basically means her body slowly falls apart from the inside. For the next 6 months, Jonah and his father watched her slowly lose control of one body part after another, until she could barely move. And remember, this is all while she was pregnant. As much as Jonah tried not to, all he could think about was his baby brother growing inside her. A little person trapped inside this collapsing body, with no way to escape, and never did. His mother died before Nathan, which was the name she chose for him, was born, taking him with her. But something happened during that last week of her life that Jonah still thinks about often, and kind of solidifies his tremendous fear of death, unfortunately. It was one of the last times he saw her. For a moment she completely forgot where or when she was, and had this conversation with Jonah, thinking he was his unborn brother all grown up, about to go to college. She had mentioned Jonah as well during their conversation, and how he was married with kids. She was just so happy, so Jonah just played along. But suddenly, mid-sentence, she snapped back, and she realized what was happening. She was dying, as was Nathan, and the look on her face was pure terror. Remember this moment because it will come into play later. Things got even worse by his second semester of college. He wasn't able to concentrate in class and began falling behind. He just couldn't bring himself to care about countries he'd never visit or equations he'd never use. And his love life was just as bad. Jonah would be sitting on the couch holding whatever girl he was dating at the time, and this chill would come over him. He would then look down and see flesh, cells, blood, and bones, and realize how fragile we all were, how our lives could end at any moment. And then his heart would begin to race, sweat would be pouring down his face, and he would start to grind his teeth. Sometimes, to try and forget about his anxiety, he would drive out to the big houses on the coastal front he used to visit with his mother. They would sneak into these houses and roleplay as the family they thought lived there. Their favorite out of all these houses was called the Egg House. As Jonah described it, it felt complete, and totally unformed, like the inside of a cleaned out egg. There was a room in this house where expensive looking paintings lined the entire wall, but the one that the two were most fond of was a series of paintings called The Land of Milk and Honey, due to the fact they were actually made out of milk and honey. This is the house Jonah comes back to. He told himself it reminded him of better times, and even began stealing little things here and there as tokens, eventually working up the courage to steal the Land of Milk and Honey. It's a very long story, but to sum it up, he made an almost exact recreation with the help of an art student. There were no alarms at the house, just one very old Russian caretaker who ends up catching him in the act. The caretaker, thinking the painting on the wall was the real one, told Jonah to leave it and just go. A thrill then began to rise in him. He realized it wasn't about the memories or nostalgia. It was the thrill of changing the rules of life, freeing something from the place it belonged. Even the tape recorder from when he was 12 was about hiding the memories from the slide of time, keeping them safe from the math of the universe. He began to see that theft was almost like a form of magic. It was about eluding common perception, finding holes in the way things are supposed to be. I know Jonah seems to be overcomplicating the way he felt about stealing the painting, but I think it made him forget about his anxiety, at least for a short time. It was something he could control, unlike his fears or the death of his mother and brother, which opens him up to the idea of what comes next. It didn't take Jonah long to find other thieves and buyers. There were these forums on the darknet where they would meet for jobs, and this is where Jonah met a buyer named Rover Knight. Over the years, he would steal priceless art and historical artifacts for Rover Knight, but somehow along the way, the two actually became somewhat friends. Jonah's only friend. Rover Knight liked to get to know the people that worked for him, so they would have conversations often in the chat rooms, and despite not really knowing the guy on the other side of the screen, he found him easy to talk to, telling the man about his childhood and even the last conversation he had with his mother. This went on for years until the day Jonah got a call from his day job asking him to come in because there was a man that wanted to talk to him. This was frustrating for Jonah since it was his day off, plus he was waiting on a call from Rover Knight about an item. Reluctantly, he just decided to go in and get it over with. When he arrived, there was an older gentleman looked about 60 waiting on the balcony to one of the model houses on the showroom floor. To Jonah's surprise, the man was Warner Arendt, a billionaire music producer who founded a company called Sigil, which led to all sorts of projects to improve recording technology. The guy also had a massive collection of rare art and sculptures, which is why Jonah recognized him. Any other day, he would be intrigued by Mr. Arendt, but today, he just wanted to get this over with. He was supposed to have heard from Rover Knight by now, and he was getting worried. But it turns out, this man was Rover Knight, and to prove it, he brought the item Jonah had been waiting for. He then says he has an even bigger order to place for Jonah, that it was so important, he wanted to explain the job face to face. Arendt tells him that he was building a clinic in the mountains where Arendt's and 5 other corporations were working on a cure for aging. It was actually a cure for death itself. In Sigil, Arendt's company was extremely close to a breakthrough, and it was something that Mr. Arendt needed Jonah to steal that would give Sigil a great advantage over the other companies. But this was a lot for Jonah to process. He began to think about all those conversations he had with Rover Knight because he never thought they would meet in person, and began to feel this overwhelming sensation of being trapped. He wanted to run as far away from Arendt as possible, but it seemed that the man could tell what Jonah was thinking and put his hand on his shoulder. Mr. Arendt then tells him, "Don't run." He says he knows how Jonah feels, that they were a lot alike. His old age had made him aware of how fragile life really was, but not just his, humanity as a whole. All it would take was a plague or a bomb, some kind of cataclysm for everything to fall apart and fast, just like Jonah's mother did. This was obviously Arendt's attempt at manipulation, using everything Jonah told him about his fears, anxieties, mother's death, and the last conversation they had against him, acting like he's the only one that understands. But in reality, this is an old billionaire who wasn't satisfied with just one legacy or one lifetime. This was his greedy attempt to live forever and build as many legacies for himself as possible. It's all about power, but Jonah at the time could not see this. He would toss and turn all night thinking about Arendt's words, how he could live 100 lifetimes, and then picturing a small white clinic on a mountaintop, Inside, he could see the cure taking effect and the happiness on hundreds of people's faces. So although the comment about his mom made him mad, he agreed to steal what Arendt wanted, a girl named Claire, who had this disorder called neotenic complex syndrome. It was extremely rare. There were only 2 other known cases in the world. It basically stopped its host from aging. Well, not entirely, as some of the kid's body seems to be frozen in time, while other parts will keep growing at different rates. For example, your liver may outpace your stomach, which has already outpaced your kidneys, or a kid could have graying hair, or the hands of a 40-year-old, but the skin and teeth of a toddler. Claire at 40 years old was in the final stage of this disease. She had no more than a few weeks left when Jonah finally tracked her down to a children's hospital in the middle of nowhere. Seeing her for the first time in that hospital bed, hooked up to all those devices, made him think of his mother, the pure terror on her face the last time he saw her, and his little brother stuck in her crumbling body. He thought of how mindlessly cruel it all was, but he could fix it. By stealing Claire, he could steal all of us. Now, I want to skip to 825 years later. It's presumed everything is gone. Things below the mountaintop worsened very quickly, in a matter of years in fact. It was a mixture between power outages and dwindling resources, which caused countries to retreat from one another instead of working together, eventually causing the people in those countries to also retreat from one another. So the entire world mistrusted each other, which then caused somebody, it was never known who, to engineer a blight to try and force everybody in every country to work together and lean on each other for help. But the blight spread too far, too fast, and now the only thing left of the world was the mountaintop, and the clinic now expanded into a city with Jonah, Mr. Arendt, and a couple hundred others that were lucky enough to receive the cure. Now, for 825 years, Jonah has lived many lifetimes and had many loves. The only problem was, he could only remember bits and pieces of all those years past. But not just him, everybody that had taken the cure. I wouldn't really call it a side effect, but it would seem the mind could only hold about 80 years worth of memory, but still retain some of the more basic memories like name, language, location. But Jonah now remembers everything. The reason? Well, because he wrote it all down in those journals I mentioned earlier. But he had forgotten all about them up until recently, stumbling upon them once again and rereading everything we just went over, and much more. Like there was a woman he had met on his first visit to the clinic. She was the love of his life and spent multiple lifetimes with her, but doesn't even remember her or their life together. He also wrote about the world's slow destruction and visiting the bottom after it was all over, which is how we know presumably nobody survived. The last entry in his journal was around 2186, and it talks about after 2 life cycles, which are memory resets I think, that Jonah was back with Inez, the love of his life, and that they wanted to leave the mountain, but wouldn't survive long without the cure. There had also been rumblings of survivors on the bottom trying to climb up the mountain, so an expedition called Forager was being planned. Jonah and Inez decided to wait until they heard something, but that message never came. That was the last page of his journal, and the only thing left was the passing of time. Jonah spent all night reading through those journals. He couldn't believe this was his first life. He really didn't remember any of it, but he could feel it. The pain and fear. The man that wrote these journals was him. But who was he now? The man that entered this shed, found these journals? It was somewhat terrifying. He began to think of the last few cycles, all the lives he's led, the jobs he's had, the loves he's lost. Working his way back to the beginning with Inez. His life had been like a snake curling around itself. But honestly, the worst part was that he was happy at times. Right then, he realized he had been wrong about everything, but a certain moment moved to the forefront of his mind. The story he told Arendt about his mother right before she had died. The terror on her face. It wasn't because she remembered where she was, like Jonah thought at the time. It was because she had forgotten. His mother had feared she had lost her place in her own story. It was the way Jonah felt now. He realized he's been a coward in every aspect of his life, running from his fears and anxieties, using death as a coping mechanism, and eventually the cure. Instead of facing everything head on, trying to find a way to accept that things are out of your control, and be happy. But Jonah would not be a coward any longer. He had decided he would rewrite his notes. He would create a book with a beginning, middle, and end. He would apply for a job at the Ridge, which was the communications center, and listen for any sign of life. then take Claire and leave. And that's exactly what he did. All those days and nights listening for any sign of life paid off. He eventually heard a distress call from Forager, then packed his things, grabbed Claire, and started down the mountain. The journey was way rougher than Jonah could have ever imagined. He knew now why nobody was ever able to climb up to the clinic. Because the forest that once covered the mountain had now mutated into giant man-eating plants. Jonah fought through the forest for hours with Claire on his back and nothing but a machete, eventually making his way to a cliff, having no choice but to jump to escape the deadly plants. We don't actually get to see the landing, but Jonah survives, just to trudge through some kind of lightning storm surrounded by poisonous air. That was a continuous swirl of yellow, pink, and purple, actually creating a brand new color no one had ever seen before. It would have been beautiful if it wasn't for the fact that it was so deadly. Jonah makes it through the poison storm, but Claire wasn't doing so well. She had no pulse and her eyes had rolled back into her head. So Jonah did the only thing he really could. He pleaded with her to survive. He told her they were so close to Forager now, and whether his words worked or not, her heart began to beat again, and her pulse stabilized. Finally, after all that, they had a little peace. The rest of the trek was long and uneventful until they came across a stream in the middle of the woods. There were signs that Forager had been there, which meant they were getting close. Now I must warn all of you, because I'm about to spoil the ending. So if you don't want to know how it ends, I suggest going and reading the story, then coming back, because it's a pretty big surprise ending. The two had stopped to rest when Jonah hears a voice over the walkie. The voice said, "If you can hear this, it's by the shore. Take it and go. There's life beyond the retreat." Jonah quickly climbed to the top of the nearest tallest tree so he could see further, and to his luck, he could see a beach. He began scanning the beach for any sign that Forager might be there, and to his surprise, there was a boat parked near the shore. Jonah jumped down, grabbed Claire, and ran as fast as he could. He had just wished Inez was there with them, which then got him thinking of the new life ahead of him. The mystery of it all? He realized it didn't really matter. What really mattered was him, Claire, and the ground beneath his feet. It wasn't about what could happen, but what's happening here, right now in this moment. Whatever was next, they would face it head on, without fear. But what came next was the last thing he expected. At the boat, Mr. Errant was waiting for them, but he wasn't really there to stop Jonah, but to tell him he wouldn't find what he was looking for out there. The Forager signal wasn't what he thought it was. So remember earlier when I said Jonah's life had been like a snake curling around itself? Well, that was more true than even Jonah himself knew. Forager had found life outside the mountain. It was sparse, but thriving. They had returned with news of this long ago. Jonah and Inez led this expedition. They said it was about returning to the earth against all odds, but still decided to return and live their lives at the retreat. But that wasn't the only time. He's done this same exact thing over and over again. He finds his books, writes a new one, makes a plan, then steals Claire and tries to escape, but always comes back begging to be let back in. Every time, going a little less far or being a little less brave. It's why Errant lets him do it, the reason he turns on this signal that was from himself. Errant had hoped that one day he would just forget about it altogether. Jonah said he doesn't believe any of it, but deep down he knew it was true. Claire then reaches over and grabs his arm, pleading with him to leave with her, while Errant tries to convince him that this time she will die within hours and Jonah lost at sea. He said it was different this time, but that's what he said every time. Jonah begins to close his eyes. He thinks about his mom and Inez. It was almost like the life he'd forgotten was coming back to him. He then thought to himself when he reopens them, him and Claire would go for good this time. The story ends with a shot of Jonah's feet, one in the ocean and one in the sand. I like to think that Snyder gives us a hint that he really did leave this time and finish his book, since the foot in the ocean is pointed towards the sea, like he's about to turn around. Regardless of his choice, this story had me thinking about it for days, and how important the memories from my own life really are. I would never give up the time I've spent with loved ones for anything. It's weird that the majority of our time we forget the little things that matter the most, like memories. I hope I was able to do this story justice in this video. I did leave some things out because Snyder does such a good job of putting you into Jonah's mind throughout the whole story. I just couldn't include it all. And from the one interview I could find, it makes sense, because it was somewhat based on his own fears and anxieties. So this was a deeply personal story for him. Plus, the somber tone of Jeff Lemire's art just really brings it home for me. The minimalism of it really makes the facial expressions of the characters stick out, which I feel is very important for such a character-focused story. But I would like to hear what you all think in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you enjoy the video, and I'll see you in the next one.